Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning on the West Coast. On behalf of the National Association of Corporate Directors and Pearl Meyer, I want to welcome everyone to our webinar today entitled Survey Says Incentives Matter, but the Devil is in the Details. What are the key executive compensation, governance, and design issues that boards and management are wrestling with, especially with regard to incentive compensation? Pearl Meyer conducts an annual survey that looks ahead to expected executive pay practices in the coming year. It provides a look at your peers' plans for 2017, their criteria for annual and long-term incentives, and how they go about setting performance metrics and goals. Today, I'm joined by David Seitz, Managing Director in the Houston office of Pearl Meyer, who led the survey project, and he will review key findings from the research. We will discuss the data and what it means for your boards as you finalize 2017 plans and look ahead to Q1 bonus payouts. We will also look at respondents' opinions on various Dodd-Frank provisions affecting compensation and how companies are planning for these disclosures. Before we begin, Ronell Perry with NACD's education team has a few housekeeping announcements. Ronell?
Thank you, Howard. Audience, please remember that you can submit a question and receive your answer directly from Pearl Meyer. You will also be opted in to receive future executive compensation thought leadership from our partners, Pearl Meyer. Please remember that you can also tweet with us at NACD and at Pearl Meyer. The presentation slides will be available for download at pearlmeyer.com/incentives-matter and right within the console. You will automatically receive one NACD skill-specific credit for your participation in today's live presentation. This credit can be applied to NACD fellowships. And if you have questions about fellowships, contact the email address on the screen. Remember, the slides and a replay will be available next week at nacdonline.org and pearlmeyer.com. David, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Ronell, and thanks, Howard. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So, as Howard said, today we're going to present some highlights from our annual Executive Comp Planning Survey. The survey included responses from over 230 companies and included input from both outside directors as well as senior management. So we're going to look at the key findings from the survey really in three areas. First, we'll look at 2017 pay projections in the area of cash compensation and long-term incentives. Next, we're going to share some key findings about incentive plans, and specifically we're going to focus quite a bit on performance-based LTI, which, as most of you know, is the fastest growing and most significant area these days of executive compensation. And then we'll finish up by highlighting some of the key findings from our survey in relation to planning for Dodd-Frank. So let's begin then with the 2017 pay projections. Now, there are no surprises here, unlike when we woke up yesterday morning. Companies reported to us that they are planning 3% merit budgets for the CEO and direct reports as we come into the end of the year and early next year. And as you can see from the tables here, the 25th percentile merit budget for executives is comparable to the 50th, so very tight distribution. This 3% also is consistent with every major salary survey this year for the workforce. Every firm that's conducted a survey has indicated that. Now, as always, we would expect actual increases for current incumbents to reflect, of course, the performance of the individual and how they're compensated today against market. So we would expect, variations based on that, as always. What about annual incentives? We've got about 6 weeks left for those of you that are calendar year companies. So we are trying to get a feel for what companies are expecting to pay out this year based on their performance during calendar 16. And what our respondents told us that you can see here, 47%, almost half, are expecting that the 2016 payouts paid in early 17 will be comparable to 2015. So that was generally a round target, a little bit lower, a little bit higher, depending upon your industry. Now, you can see here it's kind of a bell shape. There are an equal number of companies, about 25%, that expect 2016 incentives to be substantially lower or significantly lower, let's put it that way, and an equal number that expect it to be significantly higher. So obviously this is a very industry-specific issue. We've got corporate earnings continue to remain a little bit sluggish, although they continue to exceed expectations, in many cases, but still sluggish for the year. So we expect overall, again, comparable to last year, but definitely going to see a mixed bag by industry. Now, long-term incentives. So as most of you probably know, most companies grant their long-term incentive awards in the first quarter of the year. Probably 75% of the world does that. And so again, we asked companies as they sat there and they're thinking about their budgets and planning for long-term incentive awards for early 17, what are they anticipating? And the majority of the companies, about 70%, 69%, said they're expecting LTI awards to be about the same, and same as last year, which makes sense in that the majority of the marketplace is also what we refer to as fair value, meaning they're targeting a specific fair value. But it is interesting to note that unlike the bonuses, there were 25% of the companies that told us they're thinking that the awards, would be higher in early 17 than they were in early 16. So this is an issue near and dear to my heart that I've spent, years studying. And I guess my comment on this is the direction of LTI is really linked to the stock market and specifically your industry. And generally speaking, if we're looking at a flat market or a market that moves within a normal zone, companies will try their best to adhere to this target fixed value. In cases where your industry sector is up or down a lot in terms of equity values, then you will see the LTI values move in that same direction, but at a much lower rate than the market. So a rule of thumb that I like to use is if your industry moved 15% in one direction, you might expect LTI values to move a third to 40%, of that movement. So you kind of need to think a little bit more about the LTI based on what's happening in your industry. The other point we wanted to share with the group, and this has been pretty consistent in the Pearl-Meyer survey the last several years, is that about 40% of the companies, when we ask them what are they thinking about with regards to their LTI design, and we'll talk more about this, about 40% of the companies told us that they're refining the metrics. We're going to talk quite a bit about metric selection in this call. And they're also about another 40% told us that they're considering a slightly different mix of LTI. So again, we find every year companies are continuing to try to fine-tune the incentive performance metrics as well as what we call the LTI portfolio. So let's move now to the subject of incentives and sharing some key findings from the survey. And as I said, we're really going to focus on performance-based LTI. So these are the long-term incentive programs that companies offer that have performance metrics. And this is important because this is the fastest growing element of executive pay. It's sort of our version these days of what stock options were 10 years ago or pre-expensing. In many cases, especially amongst the S&P 500, it's the most significant, most valuable element of compensation. But it's also the area of compensation where we try to ensure there's pay for performance. We all want pay for performance and executive compensation. And it's through these programs primarily that we can accomplish that objective. And finally, it's where we can influence behavior and focus, which is one of the purposes of incentive plans. And, we're going to start there. We firmly believe at Pearl-Meyer, based on our consulting experience, that well-designed executive incentive plans can be a catalyst and help drive business strategy. They're a corporate process. They can play a key role. They can influence, drive, and behavior and focus. They can reinforce the business strategy. They can communicate what's important. But we did ask in our survey what board members and the management felt about whether these programs make a difference. Do they derive behavior and focus? And we're going to share those results, but I think here, Howard, we wanted to kick it off with an audience poll and see what the audience thinks.
That's right. So, Ronell, if we could have the first polling question, please. So we'd like everyone to please respond to what extent you believe that executive incentive plans impact behavior and focus. And David, what do you expect our responders are going to say?
Well, it would be interesting. As I said, Howard, we definitely believe they can, and they don't always impact the behavior and focus in the way that we want, which is one of the tricks of incentive design. But we also believe, and we're going to talk about this as we continue the webcast, that in order to get the most out of these programs, we've got to really focus on 4 key levers. So we're going to talk through that. So let's see. Ronell, do we have a tabulation of the results? Okay. So interesting. So of the audience participating today, we've got 44% that believe these plans can have a significant impact. 51% said some. So in total, that's over 90% believe that they do impact behavior and focus. Very interesting. This almost mirrors exactly our survey. Our survey showed about 40% of the respondents said they could have a significant impact, and about 45% said some impact. So it's almost identical, and then there was in our survey a group that said little. So very interesting to see that this is consistent with our broader survey of 230 companies. So as I said, we believe these programs can do this, but that they're really, like most things in business, it comes down to execution. We can have the greatest strategy in the world, the greatest game plan, but if we don't execute it. And so as you think about these performance-based LTI plans, incentive plans, there's really 4 key levers that we have to work with. And these 4 levers, by the way, this transcends all industries. It doesn't matter whether you're an energy company, technology, retail, all boards and senior management need to grapple, with these 4 issues. So the first issue, of course, is the metrics. What are we measuring? We get what you measure. And then once we do that, we have to set targets for these programs. That's basically the goal setting. Then we get into what we refer to as compensation consultants as the incentive scale, or basically the leverage in these programs. And then there's the issue which we'll talk about is often overlooked, which is communication. And that's one where we don't have a slide in here with this stat, but we were speaking to Howard about this. One of the things that came through in our survey was we asked a question about how well do you believe the executives understand these incentive plans, performance-based LTI, but we also asked for annual. And it was interesting to us that consistently the outside directors rated the level of understanding about 15 to 20 points higher than the senior management. So we thought that was interesting and significant, that difference in the understanding.
David, this is Howard. So it sounds like one of the tasks for boards in having an effective compensation plan is confirming that the management team really does understand the incentives and what behavior is being sought through use of the incentives. Would you agree?
Absolutely, Howard. That's the original purpose, and we were scratching our heads a little bit to say what's driving that delta, and maybe it's because as compensation committee members in particular, not full board members, spend a lot of time reviewing these plans and programs, talking to management about it, really getting down into the nitty-gritty, whereas the general participants don't get into that level. It's also possible that board members, like many things in the business, assume that there's an execution, communication, and just assume that happens when in some cases it doesn't. But we're going to share some ideas today on how we might improve that. So let's start with the issue of performance measurement selection. And the heart of any incentive plan, whether it's for a CEO, an executive, a salesperson, entry-level employee, are performance measures. And one of the questions we asked in our survey was, well, what's the process that companies use, the the board, the comp committee, and management to select these measures. And what we've highlighted here are what companies consider to be very important. And so one of the interesting things that jumps out here is one of the most highly rated, very important consideration was committee and board preference. 54% said that that's very important when they select these incentive metrics. And then we had correlations with shareholder value. The middle bar there is management preference. Now, one thing we should point out with management preference is that the outside directors rated management's preference is very important about 70% of the time. So outside directors definitely want to know what the CEO and senior management, what their preference is. What is notable here, too, is the lack of emphasis given to the proxy advisors, that write their reports. So on the one hand, it's good. We were thinking about this, that, all stakeholders want to be sensitive to, the views of the other committee members of management and vice versa. On the other hand, in selecting these measures, obviously it comes down to the specific company and their industry and their business strategy. So one of the things we observe often as consultants is sometimes the compensation committee members will come from a completely different industry, and they'll have spent their career with under different type of incentive plans. And, they kind of bring that perspective to the table, which can be helpful. But, sometimes the companies, not just their industry, but where they're at in their business life cycle and their strategic priorities are completely different. We would encourage companies to take a more comprehensive approach, when selecting these performance measures. They're so important. We've listed some of the issues here. It starts with business strategy, we believe, leadership strategy first and foremost. There's no one-size-fits-all or holy grail performance measure. We've got to think about correlation with long-term value, the trade-off between accuracy of the measure and complexity. Do we report on these types of metrics? We also should step back on occasion and come back and say, what kind of behaviors are these plans driving? And that's something that's not always obvious from the boardroom meetings, is the type of behaviors that you're getting by operating management. So we would encourage companies to take a more systematic approach. And as a comp committee member, a good question is just simply why have we selected these measures periodically? What's the basis for it?
David, how often do board members and comp committee members get input from the covered executives about the incentive measures chosen and whether the executive thinks that's the best measure, and do boards and committees take that into account?
Yeah, it's a good question, Howard. They when they get that input is periodically when there's more of a wholesale redesign of the plans. But personally, I think in a lot of cases, some of the more subtle, day-to-day influences that the metric has on behavior and decision making, are not as obvious. And in fact, with all these incentive programs, and this, whether it's a management program or otherwise, sometimes the behaviors you're getting are counterintuitive. You don't think that's taking place. I remember a hot subject right now in the financial sector, is the cross-sell ratio in the Wells Fargo situation. But I remember 20 years ago reviewing a bank's incentive plan where the cross-sell ratio was very prominent. And, we were having discussions at the C-suite level and with the committee about, what types of behaviors, might that metric drive. So
maybe the lesson we can draw from that, if I can call it an understanding gap, that we were talking about when you described how well the board members understand the plan versus how well the executives understand the plan, is to involve them at some point, maybe at the tail end when it's nearly baked, to just do a check and make sure that we've got the right levers in place so that we can avoid a mistake. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. And, we're in business cycle right now where companies are trying to get growth. So sort of a textbook example is are your incentive plans. We did see an uptick in the use of revenue and top-line metrics and executive incentives, but are your plans encouraging and enabling growth, or are they more focused on, return on investment and actually discouraging, growth? So, we've got a tough issue there in selecting the incentive plan metric, but then step two, once we've selected the metric, is we have to set a target for that metric, a goal. And this, I've always thought of this as really the Achilles heel of incentive plans. We can go through a good process, we can have the right measures, they can fit the business and the strategy, but how do we set a target that has the appropriate amount of stretch in it? Isn't, as one committee I worked with, a poodle jump for the participants, but on the other hand, such a stretch that it's really, demotivating to plan participants. And as you can see here from this slide, 64% of the respondents in our survey indicated that they find it either difficult or at least somewhat difficult to arrive on the appropriate financial target in these long-term plans. And I would say, this has always been a challenge going back to when these long-term incentive plans, they usually have a 3-year time horizon now. There was a time when they were 4 or 5 years. But what's made it worse is the pace of change in business. And I know we talked about this, Howard, but I've seen plans where 3 months into the 36-month period, for various reasons, the goals were no longer appropriate. And, really a difficult issue for the committee and for management to say, what do you do in that case?
Well, you're right. We talked about this, and as you know, I serve on 3 public boards, but my day job is dealing with distress. And it's not uncommon that by whatever point in the year you're at, the performance is way behind the threshold, and so the incentive is no longer influencing behavior. And on the one hand, it makes sense to change it and reset it, but on the other hand, there's the kind of moral hazard of dealing with the fact that, you changed the goalposts, so are you going to change them again, and will people not believe in the incentive, and should we hold them more rigorously to it? It's a trade-off, but you've got to deal with reality.
Yeah, it really is. And, one of the ways in recent years, and there's been a little bit of a pushback on this from, the institutional advisor groups, but one of the ways companies were trying to address that is they were breaking the 3-year performance period into really a series of 1-year goals or shorter goals. Still not paying and settling the award until 3 years to give it a long-term horizon. So there was probably a time as we were coming out of the global recession where as many as 30% of large companies were going with that approach. But there's been a lot of pushback on that the last couple of years from these advisors saying, we don't think that's a long-term incentive plan if you're measuring performance in a series of 1-year periods. So we see this from our consulting seat all over the map. We see companies, I could name you Fortune companies where their long-term incentive plans paid out 9 out of 10 years right at about target in an industry that's under change, clearly being run as more of a fixed pay program. I could also tell you about companies where the long-term incentive plans paid out 50% of the time and the company's performing, by any measure at the top of their industry, including total shareholder return. A clear indication, that the operating bar is really being set too high. So it's a difficult issue. What we recommend to companies, committees, and management on this target setting issue is, rather than just take one number that's presented and maybe it came from some financial forecast or plan, to try to have a framework here where you look at some different perspectives. This is the metric that's being proposed. This is the target for the metric, rather. Here's how it compares to our plan, here our past run rate, what the industry doing, so those historical perspectives. But then what about going forward? If it's for some of the metrics, earnings-related revenue, you can easily get sort of a consensus of the investment community. You can, if the company has a strategic planning process or a thoughtful multi-year plan, we can compare it to that. But I call this contextual analysis. We can get some different perspectives, again, to facilitate the discussion between management and the committee as to, what's the right amount of stretch. And often this leads to a greater level of comfort and satisfaction. but a very difficult issue. Now we've got a target, we've got our metrics, then we have to grapple with this issue that, as compensation consultants, again, we refer to as an incentive scale. You'll hear some people refer to it as the leverage. And this, I believe, is truly the most neglected issue in incentive pay out there. I mean, fundamentally what we're talking about here is as a company performs, above or below on that metric, how sensitive is the incentive pay, right? So we're really talking about the sensitivity to pay for performance, if you will, on that metric. And this, I think this was our hypothesis, but what the survey confirms is most companies, 73%, set these incentive scales using a simple formula. And one of the classic formulas, I don't know the origin of this, I've never researched it, but it was probably something a compensation consultant made up in the 70s, is, if we perform at 80% of the target, then we'll call that threshold, and maybe we'll pay half the award. If we come to 120% of target, we'll call that max, and there we'll pay whatever our max is, let's say 2x the compensation target. So that's kind of, formulas are an interesting starting point, but like all formulas, they can be a little bit dangerous. They can end up paying too much for a given level of performance or vice versa. And really, as we look at what we ought to be thinking about, when we set these incentive curves, we ought to be thinking about, first of all, what is the metric? Some metrics have a higher correlation, there's more sensitivity between the value of the company, the equity value, and that metric. Also, an important consideration is the target. If Howard's the CEO and everyone's expecting $2 earnings per share, but we have a stretch goal of $2.10, that's a different context than if we say, well, Howard, we're going to make the goal $1.95. So, we ought to be, when we have a really ambitious stretch target, we ought to be more forgiving for missing that target, and vice versa. And then lastly, there's how much risk are we trying to inject in the program? I've always found a very useful exercise at companies when we get into these issues is to look back at the history of the plan and as it's evolved and say, well, what has this plan paid out? And I think you can get some fascinating insights into, over time how the plan is paid out, gives you some sense of the historical, riskiness of the plan.
David, here's another question. So, we know that setting executive compensation is one of the most important roles of the board, one of their most important duties, and one of the best ways they can exercise an influence over performance. And, of course, we also know that how they set the compensation is one of the areas that is frequently focused upon by investors like activist shareholders, but not only them, as to whether the board did or didn't do a good job. So how should the board create a record of the process they went through to set these incentives, and how does Pearl Meyer work with the committee to help them do that?
Yeah, so as we're talking about here, Howard, I think what we would recommend is a little bit more systematic approach, as we just talked about, to the selection of these performance measures, where we gave some examples there of a half a dozen or more things that you would consider, rather than just, here's what the industry peers are doing at the other extreme, and, this is what management's recommending. So a more holistic approach to looking at that. The same thing with the target setting process. And I suppose like other, board governance issues, there's having some, thoughtful discussion at the meeting around these issues. So, coming back to let's take this issue of the incentive curve. It gets very technical very fast, but I would venture to say a lot of times the committee and management don't really have, detailed discussions about this issue. So simply engaging in a discussion to say, well, what is this sensitivity today in this curve that we're using? Is it a simple formula? Why are we using that formula? So having some discussion around that, and then of course you get from a external-facing shareholder standpoint, to the CDNA, where you have an opportunity in the CDNA to highlight again, why you are using, what you're using. certainly on the performance metrics, on the issue around goals, on an after-the-facts basis, ex post, the company, has an obligation to explain to the shareholders, how they performed, why they paid out the way they did and how they performed against goal. So
how about disclosure of the comparable companies that were chosen? Do you think that's a good idea, bad idea, or it depends?
Well, certainly as it relates to a peer benchmarking peer group, that's referenced, whether it's benchmarking compensation levels or plan design, that's pretty much standard these days. As it relates to, another way peer groups can be used, you don't always, like we were talking about this goal-setting process, you could certainly go look at a peer group and benchmark it just as you could for your budgeting process, and you can do some analysis, and that can be used as a point of reference, and then it's a judgment as to whether you want to what extent you want to highlight that, in your CD&A disclosure. But that's another way that you can utilize the peer group. So, this is a really complicated issue, but very important, the incentive curve. And sometimes when you dig into this, I had a client once that what we found was, and the committee sort of had a hunch of this, but they really needed to dig into it a little bit more. The company was barely profitable. They were a publicly traded company, but yet when you looked at the incentive plans, sort of the slope of the line was rewarding growth at about 3-to-1 ratio over improvements in profitability, when in fact it should have just been the opposite. They should have been emphasizing growth or emphasizing profitability, rewarding incremental improvements in profitability at a far greater rate. And sometimes, unless you really dig into this, that's not so transparent.
Yes, I mean, speaking as a board member, I can imagine a situation where it might make sense to reward growth over profitability because it may be the nature of the business that you're building. Obviously, you can't do that forever, but the point is, if you are doing it, make it explicit and get it into the minutes of the comp committee about what you did and why you did it, and get Pearl Meyer to support that with whatever data might be available. We had a question from one of our attendees I'd like to mention, which has to do with if you do reset the targets, it's important, I think, to state the reason and make sure you make it explicit and don't make a habit of it.
Yes, absolutely. And we're going to look at an example in a bit on the annual incentives about the use of discretion, but absolutely, when discretion is exercised, it's not as if that's forbidden. Compensation committees are very cautious about doing that. But it is done, and there it's going to require, a thoughtful business rationale and a thoughtful explanation in the CD&A if you're a public company. So the last, I jumped ahead one. The last issue in the incentive, the so-called levers, so to speak, is communication, and we've already started talking about that a little bit. And this is, communication is often sort of an afterthought with these incentive plans. And, if we really want them to help drive and influence the right behaviors, we should be thinking about the communications. Far too often what happens with these long-term incentive plans, more often than you would think, is an executive's given an award, it's emailed to them, and it says, here's your award for the 2017 to 2019 performance period. Congratulations, Howard. We'll see you in 3 years. Now, I mean, that's the essence of it. They will get back to you in 3 years and let you know it was paid out. So basically, the companies communicate the award. They communicate the legal terms and conditions. They don't get into why are we using these metrics, why does this fit with the business strategy, let alone, how you can influence that as a manager, influence those metrics. And what about progress reporting, as the period sort of unfolds. So we see lots of opportunities for companies to do a better job on really the communication of the programs. So I think at this point, Howard, we've been through these 4 levers, and I think we wanted to get another poll from the audience here.
All right, thank you, David. So we'd like everyone to read the question: in which incentive area do you believe your company could do a better job with execution? And while you're responding, David, what do you anticipate we're going to hear?
Yeah, so we did not ask this question specifically this way in our survey. We see lots of opportunities, Howard, in all these areas. My experience is that when the committees and management, when they have robust discussions, it's often around the performance metrics, and these issues get increasingly harder, as you go. Setting the targets, dealing with the complexity of the incentive curve we just spoke about. One thing I forgot to mention that we would recommend to committees, back to understanding and communication, I think it's worthwhile for the committee occasionally to say to management, can we see what you're communicating to participants about the program? I think that's a very useful thing for the committee to see and be aware of. So let's see. I guess I would predict maybe opportunity in all these areas, but Renell, can we get a summary? Okay, interesting. So the audience is saying that the performance metrics, it feels like they must feel like they're doing a pretty good job of that, 9%. See some area for improvement. Target setting, consistent with our survey, 30% said they feel like we could do a better job in that area. Now that's interesting on the incentive curve. Most of the audience, only 9% said they see opportunities for improvement. So I don't know if that means, Howard, they're happy with the formulas, or there's a lot of complexity there, so it's hard to improve. And it seems like the audience agrees that there's good opportunity to improve communication. And then, of course, we've got 28% of the audience saying, all of the above. So we see a lot of opportunity across the board to improve. And again, this is where when we say the devil's in the details, it's these types of issues. And we're dealing with the largest component of executive pay. So let's move on, and we want to be sensitive to time here. As those of you who are regular listeners to the NACD webcast know that we've talked a lot about relative TSR plans in prior webcasts. We've done a lot of research. Pearl-Meyer has with Cornell, so you can find that at the NACD website or Pearl-Meyer. We did ask participants about two technical issues with these relative TSR plans. One is, unfortunately, we haven't had too much of this, but what about situations where you've got great relative TSR, you're outperforming, 90% of your peers? That's the good news. Bad news is it's negative. Your TSR is negative 20%, and the 75th of the group is minus 30. Well, 50% of the companies say, and under those circumstances, they have no provision, so presumably they'd go ahead and pay the awards. So if that called for paying out 2x target for a minus 20% shareholder return over 3 years, so be it. Another 25% of the sample said that, no, they have a provision in place where they'd make some adjustments to the awards in a downward manner. And some companies leave that to committee discretion. So hopefully we won't have that kind of bear market, but, that's an important issue given the number of relative TSR plans. As is acquisitions. We just think of the announcements in recent weeks of companies being acquired. So how do you deal with that? 42% of the companies exclude the company that was acquired. So you have to be there the whole 3-year period. And the reason for that is usually when a company is acquired, there's a takeover premium, and companies feel like if they leave the company in the group, that they're sort of giving them credit for that premium for being, bought out. So another issue that we see. So let's keep moving here. All the issues we talked about in terms of the 4 key levers for performance-based LTI apply equally to annual incentives. But we have all those questions in the survey. We wanted to highlight a couple of points on annual incentives, though, we thought you might find of interest. And this gets into these unusual events, adjustments for unusual events that we were discussing earlier, Howard. And one of the things we wanted to point out to the audience here is 70% of the companies told us that they make these adjustments on an ad hoc basis, meaning it's not hardwired into the incentive plan. They don't build into advance, our plan says formulaically we're going to adjust in this manner for X, Y, and Z. They leave it to the judgment of the committee. Now, What types of adjustments do we see most frequently? Well, of course, the first relates to usually mergers, non-recurring, restructuring type of charges. Asset write-downs, about 50% of the world said they would often adjust for that. And then we've got a couple that are a little tougher, extraordinary foreign FX rate changes, and then share buybacks. But this to us is another example of, we'll often get the question from committees is, gee, do companies adjust for this? Should we adjust? And the answer to that is often, it depends. This is another one where the devil is in the details. It depends on the circumstances, the materiality, that led to the adjustment. So it's hard to just to say, one size fits all.
Well, let me give an example. So one of the public companies on whose board I serve had an earnings call recently, and part of the earnings call was describing a write-down due to impairment of goodwill, which could be restored later if the company does better or the market comes back. But one of the investors asked, well, how does that affect the measurement of incentives in either direction, either the write-down or the restoration? It's a very good question, and I'm not sure that the comp committee had thought about that. So maybe the lesson here when you're setting the incentives is to the extent you can, make a list of those things that might occur that are not currently foreseen that might be a reason to make adjustments. What do you think?
Yes, I think that's a good governance practice, Howard, to have that list. Also, in those situations where something does occur, very common to run it, pro forma with and without, so you can kind of frame up for management and the committee, what is the impact of this. And, getting into a discussion, goodwill impairment's a tough one. A lot of times it's the best long-term strategic decision to write it off, but you get into issues about, well, what is this we're writing off, and why did we buy this, and who is responsible for the original purchase decision? Those types of considerations. So I think the point is, a list is good, analysis of with and without, and then not to go to necessarily hardwired into the plans, because one of the things that we do find interesting, we saw this after the recession, we see it, we had as many as 40% of the respondents in our survey say last year that they actually did exercise discretion. Discretion's become a little bit of a dirty word with some groups and incentive plans in recent years. It's like, oh, well, that's, we're being too forgiving. But we continue to see boards and committees, try to do the right thing and really, step in and apply business judgment, when that makes sense.
Let's keep our eye on the clock and move along.
Yeah, very good. Well, we're going to finish up with just a couple of key findings on the Dodd-Frank issues in compliance. So our survey asked a number of questions about the CEO pay ratio and planning actions that companies are taking. So there's a lot more there. But a couple of points we wanted to highlight for the audience. This point we found, again, interesting and consistent with what we would have expected. Most companies told us 86%, and this is the directors again and the employees, that they were more concerned when they thought about it, about employees comparing their comp to the median employee, which is part of the new disclosure, as opposed to the CEO. Most companies and public companies, people have an idea what the CEO is paid. It's in the local newspapers. It's on the internet. It's everywhere. The big revelation under the new CEO pay disclosure is the median employee. Most companies have no idea what the median employee is paid in a company. And so we'll have to see how this plays out, but this may be another example of, unintended consequences of a regulation. We also asked, to what extent do you feel like you're ready to answer questions, inevitable questions you're going to get from your workforce about, how their pay compares to the median. And about a third of the companies told us, they either weren't confident at the moment or they simply were unsure. So we've got an issue that's coming down the road here, and, most companies aren't really sure at the moment, how they're going to address, those questions. So a lot of work to be done, during 17 as you prepare for that first disclosure in early 18. We're going to finish up here with the other aspect of Dodd-Frank legislation. These are proposed rules, of course, the proposed pay versus performance disclosure and the proposed Dodd-Frank clawback rules. And pretty consistent finding here. What we see is that the blue slice here, which is about half the companies, are in a wait-and-see mode. They're the rules in a proposed form. They have been for well over a year now. Companies are waiting till the regulations are in final form, before they really do too much. You've got at least a third of the companies in both cases, the green slice, that has discussed the rules at a high level with the committee. And then you've got the red slice where some companies have taken a step further. Certainly in the area of clawbacks, you can do an inventory, compare your current clawback policy, of which most companies have adopted, although there's a variety of different forms. But you can compare that to the proposed Dodd-Frank clawback rules and see how different it is. It will be different, and what changes you would need to make. In the area of the pay-for-performance disclosure, well, we don't want to hold out too much hope. The SEC's received thousands of comments about that proposed disclosure. Most believe it's not necessarily going to make pay-for-performance that much clearer. So I guess there's some hope that that could be changed. But there are about 10% of the companies that have taken the step to actually model what that proposed disclosure would look like and share that, amongst the committee. So that's what we're seeing in that area. I think that really concludes our prepared comments. Maybe just to close here with a few key takeaways that hopefully you got from today's session. Incentive plans are critical. Their variable pay is, depending upon the size of the company, as much as 75% of the executive pay package. Performance-based LTI is the fastest growing element of executive pay. It's the most significant element. But if we're going to get the highest ROI on it, get the most out of it, then we really do need to pay attention to these details that we discussed today. We've given you 4 levers that you can think about. And we've talked about the importance of communication here and certainly the difference between the committee's perception of that and the board versus management. Still early days. There's a lot of work to be done preparing for the communication of the CEO pay ratio, with the workforce. So a lot of work to be done there. There's still time. And similarly with the other aspects of Dodd-Frank legislation, we could start taking some actions there, inventorying the clawbacks. So I guess at this point, Howard and Rennell, we've got a little bit of time. We'll see if we have any questions.
So here's a question we got from one of our audience members, whether with regard to stretch targets, the comp levels that the board intends to associate with various performance levels of the stretch target, whether those comp levels should be communicated to the management team ahead of time, or should it be like a black box with a big reveal after the fact?
Well, typically you would want to communicate ahead of time at various levels of achievement on the metric where, what you would pay. Now, there are companies that don't, there's different philosophies on that. There are times where you want to communicate at more of a range. You don't want to kind of box yourself into a corner. So, I guess different points of view on that. But the one thing, Howard, that also reminds me is another one of these really subtle details and incentives which are so important. Let's say that you and I, we have a debate and we all agree that we're setting a pretty ambitious stretch target, right? Back to what's the compensation opportunity? Forget about, if we beat that, just that target. And I've seen this over the years where companies, in essence, setting a upper quartile, 75th percentile target, but yet their compensation opportunity is marked at 50th percentile because that's their philosophy. So, in effect, we're saying you've got to perform at the 75th to earn 50th. You can also see it the other way, where the company's setting the bar a little bit low, but then paying a market competitive 50th target, for underachievement. So that's what we refer to as, the calibration of the incentive payout with the goal that's being set, right? a lot of time we just debate the goals and the schedule, but then we don't adjust the compensation targets. Something with the annual incentives. A lot of the annual incentives, I don't know if we mentioned this, 70% of the time the annual incentives targets are tied to the annual budgeting process. So the annual budget is approved by the board, typically in the fourth quarter right now, by the full board, not the comp committee. But the compensation committee then comes back to that in the first quarter when they set the targets. So in effect, when the compensation committee meets with management in Q1, in 70% of the cases, they've already inherited the performance target, right? Comes from, in the case of the annual plan, it comes from the budget. So there's an interesting disconnect there in terms of the timing, which means at that point in the governance process, what the comp committee has to deal with is making sure that the compensation opportunity is consistent with the goal, with the target.
David, our NACD members serve both on the boards of public companies as well as private companies. So what differences do you see in terms of setting compensation and compensation incentives in public versus private companies?
Well, that's an interesting question, Howard. In fact, we just have published an article on that. It's in the Family Business Journal this month on the differences in a private company, but particularly a family-held company. One thing overall, I'm sure that most of the NACD board members are aware of this, but generally the governance on executive compensation is more informal in the private family company. Now, we always say that the aspects of good executive pay governance, could look the same in the private environment. Maybe a little bit more informal, but the process that you would go through, could be similar. But everything that we're talking about as it relates to incentives, would apply. I was working with one private company last year, and they had an incentive plan that was tied to a stock price metric. And I thought it was interesting because, wow, they were setting a really tough goal. I mean, they were basically saying the equity value of the private company had to grow by more than, 10% per year at the target. And I thought to myself, wow, think about these days, just the market overall, expecting that your stock's going to go up 10% per year. Again, that I'm not sure they realized that essentially they were setting, probably a 90th percentile goal. So they do need to grapple with all of the same issues. The other thing I find fascinating there, Howard, is, there's a lot of, as a public company, we have to deal with a lot of different things, and of course we have the proxy disclosure. But that transparency and that process of having to summarize all that and go through it generally means that, we're all more familiar with the plans. I find a lot of times in private companies, they can have some very interesting incentive plans, but, because they don't have to go through that process of summarizing it, that the committee doesn't quite, and frankly, a lot of the participants don't understand the plans as much. The last comment I would make about private, which I think is, really a tremendous competitive advantage these days, is they have freedom. As a private company these days, when the equity markets are booming, you're at a competitive disadvantage in the war for talent, because we don't have the equity. But these days, as a public company, you've got everybody looking over your shoulder, critiquing the plans and what you should do, and focusing on these compliance lists. Whereas a private company, you have an opportunity as the board and management to say, okay, how do we want to design these programs? What do we think is best for the business? So I think that's a great advantage these days.
David, in a situation where TSR is being utilized, obviously that brings into play the market component, and you could have a market turndown where the company's own internal performance otherwise would have resulted in a big gain. So when you use TSR to determine performance or achievement against incentives, how do you factor in the market component, which may not be related to the performance of the executives?
Well, one point we should note about relative TSR plans, which have become all the rage, is, and this has been pretty consistent over the last decade, is you'll find that only about 1/3 of companies put all their eggs in the relative TSR basket for reasons like that question, Howard, you're describing. So what you will find most companies is they will use, and it varies whether it's 50-50, but you'll find they put part of the long-term into a relative TSR plan, and then they'll put the other part of it into operating metrics. So thereby, you get some balance between what's going on with the relative TSR plan, all the chaos, noise in the markets, how it's affecting the industry and your relative performance, versus how you're doing against operating measures. And personally, I like that a lot. I feel like it's a balanced, provides more of a balanced scorecard.
And do me a favor, just so our attendees all know what we mean by relative TSR. Go ahead and give us a definition.
Oh, yeah. So TSR being total shareholder return, so your stock price appreciation plus your dividend yield. So if you had historically, a stock that had a 5% appreciation and a 3% dividend yield, that would be an 8% TSR. So when we talk about TSR, total shareholder return plans in corporate America, they're almost always relative, I would say 85% of the time, and you're measuring your TSR over a time period. It's usually 36 months or 3 years, relative to either a peer group that management and the committee have selected or an index. And practice there is split 50-50. In fact, it's been moving toward more of an indexed approach. So the idea is we've talked about this in prior webcasts, but and there are many drivers behind the explosion of relative TSR plans. But one relates to the absence of a need to set goals. We simply say, well, if we perform at the 50th over this period against the group, then we'll pay the target. If we beat the group, and the U.S. market norm is if we're at the upper quartile, 75th percentile, we'll pay 2x target. If we perform at the lower quartile, 25th, we'll pay threshold, half the award. So it obviates the need to grapple with these tough issues we've discussed here today, which is goal setting, and really says we'll reward you for outperforming your group. Of course, it has no line of sight, and the other research we've discussed in prior webcasts is we have found through our research with Cornell that there's no relationship between having a relative TSR as an incentive metric and then subsequent either financial or TSR performance. So it's not really a driver of future shareholder value.
David, in the realm of public companies, these proxy advisors are increasingly playing a role like ISS and Glass Lewis. Do you think that the pay ratio disclosure will influence what those advisors like ISS recommend regarding say on pay?
Well, two comments on that, Howard, and this was in our survey. We are expecting, as you might expect at the moment, that companies are not planning to change their pay programs in any way because of that CEO pay ratio disclosure. I think 85 or 90% of the respondents said we're not planning any changes right now. Now, as to whether ISS, I think it's fair to say, and their ever-evolving scorecards that they use and say on pay voting test, and then they prepare their report and all their commentary, I think it would probably be, I would predict that that ratio or the companies will find its way into the report. I don't think in the early days, and this is the way a lot of the commentary is in the ISS reports, is it's in there and they kind of put pluses and minuses and they make observations, but it doesn't weigh heavily into the analytical model. Historically, in recent years, the ISS model leans very heavily on the so-called pay for performance test, which has 3 components and is a subject for another day. But it's heavily based on the analytical model. And so, Howard, I think it's fair to say, in fact, just this week, they've announced this, from our perspective, is very good news, that rather than just looking at the 3-year TSR as the sole performance metric, they intend to look at 6 other operating metrics in addition to TSR.
Thank you, David. Well, we're just about out of time. On behalf of the National Association of Corporate Directors and Pearl Meyer, I want to thank all of you for listening in today. I want to thank David Seitz and his colleagues at Pearl Meyer for providing us with a very thought-provoking presentation. I want to remind everyone that the next program, the top 5 questions boards should be asking in 2017, will be offered on December 1st, and you can register for that now. And I want to wish everyone a very nice day, and thank you for participating.